And you must remember that because of no instant analysis by a group of network talking heads, we needed to pound our point over and over and over again. So Douglas had notes, I had notes, and I spoke off of those notes, but most of it was extemporaneous.
Front row.
Mr. Douglas, why did you accept his challenge to debates in 7 debates when you'd already made speeches and you were the leading candidate and well known, he was not?
I was asked why I decided to debate him, even though I was the top dog in the country. Speaking of dog, Honest Abe dogged me throughout the state. When I would give a speech, he would be there waiting around, and once I would finish, he would stand and he would state, "Please wait a while, I will give you my interpretation of what I believe."
And Mr. Douglas, some of those were the following day, but the people would have a tent or camp out with their buckboard and stay to hear my remarks. But that it wasn't like the two of us being together, actually.
No, not at all. I think it was weakness. I think it was pure weakness, and also the little giant. I knew I was the best, and why not just whip him into submission?
Right here, the red shirt.
Mr. Lincoln, there is a story that you once walked several miles to repay several cents that had been paid extra by a lady who had bought something from you at your store. I was wondering if you could just confirm that story for those who doubt it.
He's asking about the New Salem situation where I was a storekeeper and a lady overpaid me. I think it was 3 cents, and a penny would buy a loaf of bread at that time. 3 cents would buy a pound of pork. So when the lady left, I thought, well, I'm this much better off. But all of us have conscience, and I realized during the day I had never done a lick of work to get that money. It was hers. She and her husband had 4 boys. So I walked to her home that night, and she hadn't realized she'd overpaid me, so she circulated that story. Yeah, very true, very true.
In back, yes.
Mr. Lincoln, what made you decide to grow your whiskers?
Well, you know, later on, when Mr. Douglas and I, 2 years down the road, would run for the White House, we had company. The Democrats divided. Mr. Douglas was acceptable only in the North. Southerners said he's not our champion on slavery expansion. We're going to run John Breckinridge. And John Bell came in as an independent. At the time that the campaign started, I had no facial hair. But I received a letter from a little girl in Westfield, New York. She said her name was Grace Bedell. She said she was 11. The evening before, she said her father came home from the county fair with a poster. She said they enrolled the poster. There were the pictures of the 4 men running for president. And you, sir, are not the most handsome of the group. So she thought whiskers would be enhancing. And people had always kidded me about the size of my ears, so I thought, well, a little facial hair will help that out. So that's true. Yes, sir.
Mr. Lincoln, when you look back on history, is there a politician that you especially looked at to shape your own views? And was there a book or books that you read with sincerity to shape your political views?
Well, I think the man I admired the most was Henry Clay, a man from Mrs. Lincoln's hometown of Lexington, Kentucky. A man who ran for president several times, never made it, but his ideas on economics, what this country was built upon, his starting of the National Road coming out of Cambridge, Maryland, up through Wheeling and over to Indianapolis, all of these things. And when I first served in the Illinois legislature, it was in Vandalia, Illinois, not Springfield, and that's where that national road was running. So economics and Clay, I think, important to me. And I also enjoyed, as a youngster, reading about our history. Books were very scarce on the frontier. And I would borrow. You never knew when you might find a farmer down the road who owned 3 or 4 books. So I could borrow. And when I read about Washington, Ben Franklin, that gave me a concept of how this country started. And I think I was always amazed and preferred reading our history.
And sir, may I add, I was the first to date Mary Todd.
She told me all about that.
There,
The lady over here.
I'm not Lincoln. He deals with Henry Clay. When I would sit and speak with Mary, she was good friends with Henry Clay. I couldn't stand Henry Clay. However, Abraham loved listening to stories about Henry Clay. Douglas moved away, and Lincoln came in and swept Mary off her feet, thanks to Henry Clay.
We have a lady right here.
Mr. Lincoln, what did your wife think of your political aspirations?
Mrs. Lincoln was very ambitious. She asked what Mary thought about my political ambitions. Mrs. Lincoln was ambitious for me. She pushed me, not really pushed me, she didn't have to push me into the political arena, but she was there for support. So a very fine lady, her father, Robert Todd, was president of the Bank of Kentucky. He was an established attorney in Lexington. He could afford to send his children to the best in private schools. They had wanted for little. So when this announcement came in the Springfield paper about our marriage in November of 1842, some of my old Whig friends came to me. They said, Lincoln, keep this in mind. Here are the Todds. Here are the Lincolns. You've been a log cabin fellow all your life. You've never had to think much about manners and grooming. We don't think this can work. I said, well, I know we're going to try to make it work. I know that the Todds do spell that name, T-O-D-D, and everyone knew that one D had been perfectly good enough for God, so I just... You pick one, Stephen. All right.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Well, he's talking about the wrestling match back in New Salem when I first went there. Jack Armstrong, and he lived over in Clary's Grove, away from little New Salem where I was. And on Saturday afternoons, he and 5 or 6 pug uglies would come into New Salem, and they would threaten these little storekeepers. And they'd say, unless you give us beer and sandwich, we're going to tear you up. And right after I got there, working in Offutt's store, he came into Offutt's store. Offutt said, wait a minute. He said, I've got somebody here who can take you, Armstrong. And he pointed to me. Well, I didn't know, but I was almost forced into it. But I think it was a draw. I don't think he won. I don't think I won. But you know, he settled down. He found a wife. He married her. They'd invite me out to their cabin on Sundays after church for cornbread and mush. So I think we established a good rapport there.
Yes.
Okay. In an address at Lincoln Hall, you said that a lot of your political sentiments sprang directly from the Declaration of Independence. So this is kind of a 3-part question. One was, what were those political sentiments? 2, what actions and ways did you use your political sentiments to either make laws in your presidency or like in the courts? And 3, how did you violate these sentiments?
How did I violate them? Well, I think number one can be, I think number one could be reviewed tonight in the sentiments I expressed about equality, about Jefferson saying all men are created equal. Now that was a purely revolutionary document that he drew up to break away from King George. But he put in there, all men are created equal. He himself owned slaves, but he knew this was going to be put in front of generation after generation, and it would begin to stick.